I'm Rich Miller. I run a small consultancy called Telematica, and we specialize in putting ourselves at the forefront of technology and product strategy. What Uwe and Gaba have done this evening is put together a really fine and rather than lovely, lively group that I almost guarantee you will keep you on the edge of your seats. So what I'd like to do is give you a quick introduction and then allow the panelists to give you a little bit more background. So to my immediate left is Adrian Cockcroft, who is the Director of Architecture at Netflix. For those of you who are involved with cloud computing, you know quite well just how much of a advanced and exemplar Netflix is of the adoption of the use of public infrastructure as the basis for delivery of highly performant, highly scalable, and quite elastic cloud-based computing. To his left, we have Barbara Holzapfel. Barbara is the Senior Vice President and the Managing Director of SAP Labs North America. Again, SAP at the height of its game right now, driving extremely quickly into areas for the enterprise in the use of virtualization and cloud. And once again, here with SAP Labs at the cutting edge of SAP. Next to her, Dr. Gregory Smith. Greg is the Vice President of Service Delivery for T-Systems. Those of you who don't know, T-Systems is a formidable and one of the world's leading providers of infrastructure. What would you say? Infrastructure as a service, infrastructure for the enterprise, kind of the managed infrastructure. I'll let you know. And is probably as conversant in the use of cloud computing virtualization for the enterprise as anybody. He lives it, he breathes it every day. Finally, Kevin Marks, who is the Vice President for Open Cloud Standards at Salesforce.com. Salesforce, probably the company best known to be software as a service pioneer, doing cloud before cloud was cool, before cloud was a word. Kevin is a longtime resident and a veteran of Silicon Valley, has worked with the top tier companies across a number of different areas and has been a very eloquent and a very vocal advocate for various aspects of cloud computing, including aspects of cloud standards. So with that, I'm going to ask you each to kind of introduce you and your position, individual position on standards, what's important, for whom are standards made, and I'll start with you, Adrian.
It's just the personal intro or the...
Well, however you want.
Okay.
No standard.
All right. So let's see. We've been using cloud now for about 3 years as our primary strategy for getting things done. And the initial take on this was we were quite early in the game. There weren't that many choices, and we went with the largest vendor we could find at the time, Amazon, the AWS, Amazon Web Services. And our position on sort of standardization was, well, let it evolve and something will come along and this will figure itself out. But in the meantime, we'll use whatever they've got to get our work done. So we're sort of the pragmatist end user of one of the largest services out there, and we've been figuring out how to use it, working with AWS to help them improve their service, and then also explaining to a lot of other people how we use AWS, and so that we create a sort of a broader use case. For the last year, we've taken that one step further. We've started open sourcing a lot of our platform code, so that if you go to github.com/Netflix, you can find quite a substantial amount of code, which is the Netflix platform running on top of AWS, and we're about halfway through the list of projects that we want to open source, and we keep coming up with more. So we're on a program to create a open source platform, which is our platform. So it's not necessarily a standard and such, but it runs on top of the AWS APIs, and so we treat that as our baseline standard. Going into that, you always think about, well, what happens if this doesn't work? What would we do? And our attitude has been, if we needed to move to a different cloud provider, it would be something like a 3-month porting exercise. It's of that order of magnitude we were comfortable with. We could take a few months and we could stop working on features, and we could just, okay, we're going to move to another platform. And that was going into it, the way we approached the idea of being, of this being a very nascent area where we wanted to pick something to go for.
Good. Barbara?
Good evening. Thank you for coming. Pleasure to see you all here. I'm going to take a decidedly business-oriented view in the sense of, if we look at cloud in general, if we look at kind of the, where software has come from and where it's going, that cloud as a phenomenon or trend or whatever we want to call it, is one of the things that is, more than anything else, driven from the business and the user side, in the sense of, we've seen a lot of cloud adoption through the lines of business, through the end users, actually looking for tools, applications, whatever you want to call it, that help them do their business job better. And so, from my perspective, we can sit here and debate technical standards and all that kind of stuff, but at the end of the day, it's really about where are the users and the consumers and the business user going to pull in terms of what they want to use.
So I'm Gregory Smith, so I'm kind of in between those two spots, I guess, in a way. So T-Systems, so we provide sort of full spectrum telecommunications and IT services, including infrastructure, platform, software as a service, but decidedly for big corporate enterprises. SAP, we deliver huge amounts of SAP out of the cloud. So we're sitting in a business space where we're having to do development, and we have to deal with technical standards and a lot of different vendors that have their own sort of standards, threads, and we have to sort of cobble all that together to try to put out big corporate services to a customer who on one hand is trying to solve business problems, but we're decidedly dealing with sort of their technical IT implementation, and we're trying to come up with a relationship to deliver services, but that also involves moving all those services, running them in conjunction with how they're running them today. So we're just trying to take the world as it exists today and build a set of services that can be consumed from the business. And it's, we sit in a mess sort of every day trying to navigate all the madness.
So my sense of standards is useful abstractions. The point is to have a set of agreements about how to do something that means that you can do it in such a way that you don't have to bother about the details of that piece because it's been encapsulated. And that is delivered or not delivered in varying degrees depending on how well the standards are specified and how well they're layered. But that's the sort of the basic principle there. How that plays into Salesforce is that we have a series of different services that we're selling to our customers, from the core CRM business, where we're effectively defining the standards and giving people something very similar that they can customize, to Heroku, which is run arbitrary code on abstracted hosting with a bunch of principles that you can run anything on, and some other sort of very focused services that are in between that and build on that. But the goal is always, as Barbara said, to think about what the customer's goal is and how do you find the abstraction that fits that.
So here we have representatives of companies at the forefront of their various industries. In each of these cases, though, we're being assailed by the pundits, by technology journalists, by various consortia of end users, vertical markets, all of whom are saying we need standards around cloud for a variety of reasons. And in fact, one of the things that I came to as Uwe presented us the premise of tonight's conversation, what is it that we're really about when we talk about standards, and is it in fact a single point of view, or are in fact there a number of different points of view from which you just start to talk about standards? In our case, we were asked, how do you address the problem of vendor lock-in? How do you increase customer choice? And how do you make vendors, all the people who turn up to deliver to customers and end users, how do you make them work together? And what's the appropriate use of standards? How do they come about? And as I thought about it a little bit more, I realized that we have been subjected to the arguments of a point of view about standards that seem to come from three different groups. And I'll give you a little warning, this comes with a little bit of cynicism, but one approach is standards are the province of the market leader. The guy who's in front, who owns an amazing part of the market, gets to set the standard by saying, I am the standard. De facto, moving to de jure, I set it, whatever I or my company decides is the appropriate approach, that will be the standard for at least that part of the industry that I engage in. There's another group who will talk about standards, and I will say this a little bit unkindly. This is the standards that are the aspirations of the group of second string players. The guys that come together in order to assail that company that is so far in the lead as to be almost impenetrable. So a group comes together and says, as a group, let's form around the standard, and as a group, represent a virtual competitor to a dominant de jure standard. There's a third point of view about standards. Standards are the expressions of desire by the consumer of the service, the end user, the corporate buyer. Which of these three makes sense? Do they all make sense in their own ways? Are they part of the way in which we go about standards? In each case, we have companies here who have a constituency that isn't dependent upon one and only one customer and user. In each case, they have a number of different groups for whom to whom they are beholden for not just customer base, but resources that they use, technology that they use. And I've asked each of the people here on our panel to address and take the point of view, one of these points of view, and give us an example of how they see their constituents and standards impact their business or have impacted the direction in which they're about to go. And could I ask you, Adrian, first to talk about who are your constituencies? Obviously, someone sitting, leaning back, watching a Netflix movie, but who else do you serve in this ecosystem? And who helps either establish the standard on which you operate or helps you dictate the standard?
I think you made a good point there that there's different situations. Let's say if there's a situation where there are two major competitors and one is only a few percent ahead of the other one, then taking standards as a strategy may tip the balance. Right? So those are the cases where somebody taking a standard and the standard won because there was some kind of alternative there. If you look back in history, if you go back about 15 years, there were lots of microprocessor architectures out there, and Intel was getting more and more traction, and all of the other microprocessor vendors and RISC vendors kept coming up with things to try and compete with Intel. And one of the things that happened there was one of those vendors produced an open standard. Does anybody know what the open standard processor architecture is? It's IEEE 1754. Do you know which one that is? It's SPARC. Sun published SPARC as an open standard, got an IEEE standard, gave all of the intellectual property away. Anyone in the world can implement a SPARC processor without any royalties or anything. Right? It's just, right? Did that help? In the end, not really. I mean, it helped a little bit, but it did not win the war. What happened was Intel was dominant, and people figured out how to copy Intel, and you got AMD as the remainder, you know, a number of people did. So you have Intel, and then you have the clones of Intel, which are sort of unofficial. They didn't get permission from Intel necessarily to build those clones. So that's a sort of an interesting analogy for the current situation, because you might say, well, what about AMD? They're kind of sneaking up on the side, and they have their own, you know, they have a big volume, and they have a different functionality. And they're starting to perhaps be finally there is a competitor for Intel. So think about what played out there, where there was a dominant standard and everyone tried to gang up on it. If you take that to today, and you look at the cloud world, Amazon is a long way ahead in functionality and scale and reliability compared to the other cloud vendors. And all the other cloud vendors don't want you to think about that. They want to make themselves think bigger. So if you look across the whole cloud industry, there's a lot of marketing where people are trying to make themselves look big, and they're ganging up on Amazon to try and make you think that they are equivalent. Although there is at least an order of magnitude difference. This is more like a 10-to-1, or perhaps more than a 10-to-1 ratio between what Amazon does and what all of the other infrastructure cloud vendors that compete with them do. So that sort of sets the scene. From our point of view, I regard sort of Amazon as the equivalent of Intel, and everyone else ganging up on them as people trying to come up with a RISC architecture that will finally beat Intel, or an open source sort of, you know, SPARC architecture. And in the end, I think that they will fail. And the ones that will win are the AWS clones, and they're already out there. The equivalents of AMD are Eucalyptus, which now has a licensed compatibility with Amazon. They get the same test suites, and they can become bug for bug. They're even compatible with the undocumented features of Amazon. That's their goal. CloudStack are in a similar position, and OpenStack are kind of on the fence. On the one side, they'd like to sell you an Amazon-compatible system, but on the other hand, they'd like to create an alternative ecosystem where they can innovate differently. So they're a little schizophrenic. But what you're seeing is this collection of vendors that are cloning Amazon. And so that's that first position that Rich talked about. As a consumer of this, we're kind of in that third camp where we're pulling in, you know, what we see to be the useful standards and the functional standards. And so we're pulling in that direction of, I will deliver code that runs on AWS. And if another clone vendor manages to figure out how to build enough features that they also run our code, which is probably likely to happen in the next year or two to an increasing extent, we will effectively have a portable platform, so we won't have lock-in, but it will be equivalent to running AMD and Intel chips in your data center and running the Linux on both of you, the same build or whatever. So that's where I think is the most likely outcome. But this is a very uncomfortable outcome if you're, you know, one of the major enterprise software vendors or hardware vendors right now, because you've kind of lost control of your destiny to this company that's really not even a proper computer company. They're a bookseller or something, right? So it's an interesting position to be in the industry right now.
So here we have Netflix, who is probably the preeminent consumer of infrastructure services, cloud services, and their approach to how do we think about the uniformity of the offers, again, without getting locked in, with the maximum ability to make decisions among different providers. Let me turn it to a slightly different situation. On the other side, Greg is running and represents an infrastructure provider selling to a different class of customer. Sitting on the other side of it as the service provider with competitors, with a variety of customers and customer interests that you have to serve, how do you think about standards? And actually, let's back it up one step. Is it standards or is it just uniformity? How do you measure and how do you deliver a uniform expected result, which at the end of the day is what standards are supposed to be about?
So, I mean, standards, if I put my technology hat on, standards, what Adrian's talked about on the process side, there's a lot of that churning going on at the bottom, this consolidation. It's good stuff. We need TCP, TCP/IP, these sorts of things, good stuff. As a service provider, all of that is a nightmare and I hate it. Because as I have to take all of those disparate standards, build a service, and deliver it to customers. And all of these vendors, EMC, NetApp, VMware, Citrix, SAN, all these people are vying for my attention to try to use our standard. The next platform rev you do, if you're a big global cloud platform, we want to integrate our technology, but of course we're on a fairly long arc of development, because you can't change that stuff because we're running corporate IT and mission critical stuff. We can't just we don't have that much discretion to change things too quickly. So we're having to do all this technology integration across disparate vendors that, in principle, hate standards. They maybe kind of like them deep down, but they actually detest them because they all want it to be their standard, right? So they all set a big vertical stacks, right? So I don't really care about technology at the end of the day, even though I come from that space. I really care about how can I deliver applications and data and business processes out to customers, right? And so that's all noise that I have to deal with, and I have engineering groups that are going to deal with that. But I'm NetApp saying, oh, I have ONTAP, a suite for managing storage, and it's great. We love it, right? EMC has their suite, VMware has vSphere, but nobody, there's very little focus or desire to focus across those technology stacks. Because at the end of the day, all of those vendors don't want to sell to me, they want to sell directly to the customers, right? So when we started talking about cloud, we were all thinking cloud outside of the on-premise customer data center. All the vendors were thinking, you all need to build your own private clouds, right? So they're desperately trying to get customers to build cloud infrastructure in their own data centers. They don't want us involved because we disintermediate them. And if you look at because we're a big telecommunications firm, the dystopian future is telecommunications, where the telco companies say, well, let's see, there's going to be Nortel and 2 other vendors, and we're going to tell you exactly the kind of gear we want you to build, and it's going to be based on hardcore standards that everybody agrees on, SONET, all that sort of thing. And guess what? You guys have no discretion, and you'll never sell directly to the customer base. You're only going to sell to service providers. Low margin, it's a terrible business, right? So that's their dystopian future for us. So they don't want to go there because they want direct selling customer, high margins, and so they'll continue to perpetuate all of the bad habits of the past, trying to leverage the great future. So again, this is back to the standards. They don't really want standards, because if we had real standards, then it would eliminate their value propositions and their differentiations that they're using to the customer base. So, that in that space, there's standards around security. I guess I would say the other big standards thing that we deal with is we'll talk about security, right? So there's people who they don't understand security in the cloud, but in principle, the problem is they don't actually understand their security very well at all. Right? So a customer comes up, hey, I'm going to outsource, I'm going to move all my IT into your data centers, and you're going to deliver it, some of it in the cloud, some of it maybe just regular hosting, classic hosting with dedicated gear. And they'll say, is it secure? And we'll say, well, okay, here's our security, set of services and what we do operationally. They say, well, what about HIPAA? What about ITAR? What about PCI? What about those things? Is it all compliant? I go, well, I don't know. That depends on your interpretation of your compliance controls and what controls you have. You tell us what your interpretation is for your particular business in healthcare or finance of those regulations are, and I'll work with you to support your needs for your compliance. Well, I don't know. We have this really big fat book that someone wrote 5 years ago, and as long as all of our employees have badges on that say the same company as I'm in, I know I can fire them if they screw up. And that's kind of their idea of the security implementation. But when they come to us, they kind of want us, what they want us to do is say, oh, PCI or HIPAA, here's what you need to do. You need to do this and that and the other, and these sorts of things. But we're not going to do that because it's not our business and it's not our regulation that we have to comply with. They have to do, right? So
in this particular case, you started out by discussing T-Systems as being, I won't say victimized, but certainly having to deal with, victimized by the folks from whom you have to acquire technology and services. And then you just talked about a change of role, where it is in fact your customers who are placing on you requirements that are in turn placed on them about standards, that is, standard behavior, compliance standards, and the like. So you're sitting there as a service provider.
We're the meat of the sandwich.
You're the bologna in the sandwich, right? Exactly.
And we're trying to evolve them, right? So we're looking to them saying, come with us to the promised land, right? And we're trying to evolve IT departments that are all pinned down with a lot of old decisions and people, and we're trying to get them out of the weeds.
And do you see standards, and they don't have to necessarily be cloud standards, but it's certainly standards that are mediated or fit to the cloud with respect to security, data privacy, and so forth, that are imposed upon you by your customers? Are your customers effectively using, and is it a good thing for them to have the standard by which to kind of come to you with a request?
So I guess two things. Most customers actually are very bad at standards, right? So if let's take two different examples, right? So one example is ITIL, right? So you come in, I'm going to move all your stuff to me. Now we're going to put a contract between part of your IT and your internal IT. We have to talk about incident management, right? Problem management. We have to talk about change management. So we want to make a change in the system. It's got to go to a change approval board, and we got to make sure it's not going to impact your systems. We have SLAs. I got to pay penalties if I don't meet the SLA. So that ability to take these ITIL processes and extend them across a contract, customers very bad at that. Most of them, no, but most of them are really bad at that because they're really like, oh my God, I can't call Fred and just say, dude, pull that patch, right? Push it. Can't do that. We'll say no. So that's a set of standards that, from our view, that's our core business, and we end up having to help them be better at that, but they hate it. This is back to the hate standards because it's forcing them to do things in a much more disciplined manner. But then it'll take something like security, where if there's some standard for some, it doesn't have to be security, it can say security. If there was some special cloud security standard, and if we all agreed on what it was, and I checked the boxes, they would say, great, everything's secure. And they'd walk away happily. I could sell the CFO and the CEO and the CIO, they would go to sleep like babies every night, even though the actual security risk issues were never addressed.
So
just to check the box.
Here's a case where standards are being used by a customer, and could be you as the customer, but in this case it's your customers. It's a totem, it's a talisman.
It's a panacea. Yeah.
It's a panacea, but it's something that they can sit there and say, all right, I have a very nice tight definition. I've just imposed it upon you, my supplier. If you say it's okay and you stand behind it, then I sleep at night. So is there any other side of having a good uniform vocabulary that comes from standards that helps you in their definition or their description of what it is they require of you? Is there a way in which standards help you?
So I guess the answer is in a perfect world or in a good world, yes, right? Because you want people talking the same language, you want people, you know, to have common understandings about what things mean. What is security? Is it operational security? Is it data security? Is it ingress security on physical data? You know, whatever. There's a whole list of things, as well as compliance issues, which is different. Yeah, so if we can have a good conversation and talk about the same thing, then it helps, right? But does it help ultimately with security when security is such a complex topic and the customers don't really have the people, the expertise, or the desire, or the money to really properly address their security? Then it's just a talisman. I mean, so Deutsche Telekom, so we're telco, right? Telco has huge security mandates, right? We have a gigantic security organization. It's enormously large. I'm shocked sometimes how large it is because they actually are having to deal with the granular security issues around telecommunications and data. We're a phone company in Germany, right? So when everybody's phone numbers suddenly leak out, it's a giant national scandal, and we hire 50 more people to make sure that doesn't happen, right? But we're having to deal with that stuff, in a very intense and real way. If I go to some of the very large corporate organizations running IT, they're not addressing security at that kind of magnitude. You can just see that there's a giant gap between their real security risk and what they're doing about security, and they're not willing to pay for us to come in and do that, so we all just kind of like turn a little bit of a blind eye. If we have some boxes we can check, that's good, and then we move forward. We know our security is better than their internal security probably is, almost certainly, and we all just move on and hope bad things don't happen.
So
we hired a PCI auditor to be our security architect.
And
so he gets to explain to people that he used to work with how we're doing PCI in the cloud, which is what we're currently working on, which is bleeding edge for the security industry, because we're having to explain new practices and situations. But it's doable, but you have to have somebody that really knows it inside out. But that's not, not everybody gets to hire that kind of person.
And just a quick, I won't take too much time, but a quick point, so we're all like that, right? So a lot of us are out running ahead of the field, right? And so the security organization are kind of drafting behind that. And in some security areas, I have to say, they've actually been pretty okay. I mean, so many people flipped into virtualized environments so quickly that they got overrun. They couldn't say no. They just got bowled over, right? And so they had to react. But if you look at standards, they're all drafted behind us, and so we don't want too much too fast because then we can't move quickly enough. But we want it at some point when things settle down on sort of the back half of the curve, we do want those there because then we want to be able to have those smart conversations with customers that all kind of understand the language that we're speaking.
So now I want to turn to Barbara. Barbara, SAP delivers among the best, but also among the most complex in terms of what it needs to accomplish. Enterprise software on the face of the planet. It is designed to be delivered to a customer with a very clear, hopefully, idea of what it is they want done, whether it's done in their in-house data center or in Greg's. Standards. Where does standardization fit into this? Where do you have your customers take the spear in hand and drive standards, and where does it get in your way?
I think there's a couple of different layers of standards, right? There's standard processes, there's standard, technical standards and things like that. So I don't think we can just lump all standards together into one big bucket. I think the interesting thing that's happening in our industry is really that, we see, there's a shift happening where traditionally, software was purchased by the IT department, it was installed in-house, and they had, rightfully or wrongfully, a certain sense of knowing what it is. If it's ours or somebody else's, doesn't matter. What it is that they're doing with that, right? It was typically driven by the IT department, who set the standard for the company on what kind of software they wanted to operate and how it was all supposed to work together. Now, there's a shift happening also in terms of who's actually the decision maker and the buyer, right? And that's where, increasingly, it's the end user, it's the line of business, it is not the IT department anymore. There's studies out there that say by the year, I think 2015, the CMO is going to be the biggest spender on enterprise software. Now, think about that. If you go to a CMO with a lot of technical stuff, he or she's going to shut you out right then and there, right? Because that's not what marketing people live in and breathe in terms of technology. It's the question, is it something that is useful for them, that's going to help them do their job better? And if the answer to that is yes, then they'll happily sign the contract. And then at some point, they'll probably call in the IT guy to say, we actually just did this, over to you, and you deal with all that technical nitty-gritty stuff, right? So the discussion changes, and the audience changes quite significantly. And I think you'll deal with different levels of fluency in terms of what a standard is or isn't and what it's supposed to do or not to do. So I think, to your point, the conversation about standards, definitely the more technical they get, move to a very different group who is very different than your decision maker.
If they have to, if you as, to some degree, the representative of that buying customer, have to discuss ultimately what the objectives of any cloud standard would need to be. Does it, in fact, go back to one of Uwe's first questions? I need to be assured that I don't have lock-in. Because in a way, the combination of SAP software, T-Systems infrastructure, are holding on to something that is the possession of your mutual customer, the enterprise that has put you in charge of and has made you the steward of their data and their processes.
I think one of the key points is that, traditionally it was the IT department, the service provider and SAP, and it was largely a technically educated group. Let's just put it that way, right? But what we're seeing is that the buyer is increasingly not technically oriented. The buyer is increasingly looking at it to say, is this something that's going to solve my business problem? If I work for Coca-Cola and I want to know where my consumers are sitting, what they're buying, and what they're consuming and why, is this technology going to help me to do that, yes or no? That's the deciding factor. Anything else in terms of does this, adhere, they often don't even care if it's in the cloud or not. It's, does it solve the problem for me? And they probably couldn't care less about the deployment, if it's on-premise or in the cloud or on Mars or on the moon. As long as it, comes to them on their mobile device, they're happy. And then the discussion of, does this, fit certain security standards? I mean, they probably call the IT guy and say, yeah, just kind of make sure, our customer data isn't leaking out to the world. It's check the box. So, but I think that creates an even more interesting challenge because the audiences are focusing increasingly on different things in terms of the actual buyer for the software, the decision maker, is increasingly less technology oriented.
And actually, that's an excellent segue, because if you think about Salesforce, what Salesforce does is deliver, again, to some of the same customers, but also a lot of different customers, the end product that you're hoping both companies can deliver, which is get my job done.
Right. Well, so there's we're talking about vendor lock-in, but there's buyer lock-in as well. When you have these pre-established processes, your biggest lock-in is, we built this thing 15 years ago and the one guy understanding is left. Whereas the stuff that that we've built that many people are already using gives you some reassurance. It's like we just had Dreamforce last week, and most of that was customers talking to each other saying, well, we did this thing, and using them as examples to each other, with the assumption that we're giving them something that's similar to what Coke bought or what GE bought for their small business as well, because we're running the same software for everyone because we've got one set of servers. Now, obviously, there is customization, there's stuff you build, but it's something different from the approach of we're going to start with your business and build everything that fits your business like a glove, and then you go, oh, we need to change something, and then there's this thing we built 10 years ago, how do we put that in? And a lot of the work that you do will be connecting these dots, but so it's something we've seen for, Salesforce started selling out to the sales department, which is your example customer who doesn't care about technology, just want to get their job done, and built on that, and have now been connecting back with people like SAP and others to say, how do we connect this to that system, how do we make this work? And defining those boundaries and how things live across those boundaries is where the standards parts come in.
So, just a quick question. I mean, so it's interesting because when we do platform software as a service, we're taking everybody's toys, right? And so all the guys who used to have the toys in the IT department get upset and they throw up a lot of barriers. And do you see that if they're really going to go to Salesforce, there's sort of an assumed umbilical cord cut, right? So they're not going to try to impose like architectural standards on you. They already know, look, I'm going to buy this service from you, and I don't even, frankly, I don't know how it works, and I don't care. Like with us, they want to look under the hood all the time, right?
There's a mixture. I mean, they have to trust us to keep the data safe, and there's outside it too. But a chunk of it is, part of what they're buying is a process that we've already built for 150,000 customers already, and so when you say this is how the sales process works, and this is what a contact looks like, and this is what a sale looks like, and this is what an account looks like, we're sort of implicitly, I suppose in some ways we're your first case of the standardization, we're implicitly saying, we've looked at lots of these, and this is what we think it looks like. If you need something different, let us know, and we'll change it, but by default, you'll get this set of stuff that sort of fits the general process, and then when you go, no, actually, I really need to understand this thing, that's when you hire a systems integrator or you in-house IT builds a special tool or whatever.
So, but actually, sorry.
Just one point I wanted to add. Increasingly, I mean, you talked about vendor locking. That the landscape is changing so quickly that with any customer that we go out, I mean, chances are they're going to have at least 3 or 4 vendors in there. They have a bit of Oracle, they have a bit of SAP, they have a bit of Salesforce, a bit of something else. And that, again, comes down to customer choice. I mean, we offer our customers a choice between do you want to run it on-premise or do you want it in the cloud, right? Take that to the next level, they're going to have stuff from very different vendors. And it's more the question of making sure that the behind the scenes, works and works together, that if you're running a sales process in Salesforce, but you want to make sure it links to another process that you run on Oracle or something else. As a customer, you just want to make sure it works. How exactly that is technically done is increasingly of less interest because the buyer is shifting
and I think,
to a business audience.
I think you hit on a very important point here. The notion of vendor lock-in may in fact be much less of an issue, and one of those issues that tends to be raised by that second group, the guys that are trying to band together in order to attack the giant. And it's a bit of a red herring. In the day of cloud computing, where almost every system has a set of exposed interfaces, in a era of cloud computing where applications are in fact composed of major blocks with reasonably well-defined and well-described to the public exposed interfaces. This notion of vendor lock-in is less likely because nobody in their right mind goes to a complete monoculture and depends on one and only one vendor's system. It just doesn't happen.
Service provider lock-in becomes the issue, right? So now, I mean, we do this all the time, right? So we're a big outsourcer. First generation is good and bad. It's good because we're pulling out of somebody's data centers, and that's like good. Second generation, if I got to move a bunch of stuff from EDS's data center or IBM's data center to my center, I am not dealing with a highly cooperative party, right? so you know, the barrier to move a service, a complex service, where you got mainframe services, AS400 services, cloud services, a whole bunch of stuff, right? Storage, you know, tapes offsite, DR to other data centers, all of the storage replication, all that stuff, right? To take that and try to move it from A to B, the barrier to do that is extremely high. And you have, you know, as a customer will sit there and say, okay, so I'm doing this because I'm coming up on some refresh on the car, so the contract's coming up, right? So, first of all, I want to like put a bunch of pressure on my existing supplier, just because it's the right thing to do, right? Then I'm going to bring in some other people to do that, but I'm also going to find, well, you know, if you can save me 20% or 10 or 15, or they like 30, but second gen, that's hard, to move their stuff, and they'll be like, you know, you got niftier, snazzier stuff, right? You know, they'll entertain that, but as a service provider, I'm looking at, okay, I got to move all this stuff. It's going to cost me like 7 to 10% of the total contract value just to move it. Then I got to save them another, you know, 20%. And if it's a first gen, then I got to, you know, I have to basically save them another 25% to make my margin, right? So I have to cut a huge amount of cost out of that. So the barrier of actually moving a complex IT environment from one provider to another is very high, very hard, very nasty. It's a grueling, horrible business. And usually the customer doesn't end up on the other side super happy about it either, other than they hope they save them some money.
Yeah, at the end of the day.
At the end of the day. After the horror and the bloodshed.
And so then I come to this whole notion of kind of having standards inflicted on us by the well-meaning governments of this world, who, in response to their citizenry, will say, we have established a set of rules about data privacy, data residency, where data has to live, and in a cloud-oriented situation where it's supposed to be elastic, flexible, data should be immaterial to the customer, hopefully where data lives. Salesforce, for example, I know has to deal with this issue when enterprise comes and says, I'm an insurance company, I'm a banking company. We are subject to the laws of pick a country, and that country says the data of a certain kind must not leave our borders. Or if it leaves our borders, we must know where that data resides at all times. Or here are the conditions under which it must leave. How does a Salesforce, working in a cloud software as a service infrastructure approach, deal with a global set of global customers, to some degree, constrained by the standards and the well-meaning protections?
Well, it comes down to, is the data resident in the place you want it to be? We have data centers in more than one country. Or can you keep it on-premise and give us an API to it that will satisfy those guarantees? And we've done both of those for different customers, and it depends on how that works. But yeah, it's a challenge that keeps coming up. It keeps coming up for everyone. Because the presumption of data being resident in one place is getting increasingly problematic, because everything is cached at edges and things as well. I imagine this must be a Netflix problem too, because you have territoriality and CDNs and things like that. You're not always sure where someone is, especially if they're tunneling and things. So do you bump into that too, or is that a...
When you join Netflix, you're joining a global service. You're a global member of Netflix. So I think there's a discontinuity here where our sort of geopolitical system was set up before the internet.
Yeah.
And so there's a bunch of assumptions in there that there are borders and you can stop things going across borders. And they haven't really reorganized the entire way that politics and everything works to say, no, I'm sorry, you can be a global member of Netflix. So, like you're a global member of eBay. I used to, before I was at Netflix, I was at eBay. But PayPal has one backend. All money that goes through PayPal in the world goes through one back-end machine that moves money between accounts. doesn't matter what country you're in, you have a PayPal account, your money is moving between these machines, which are in the US. So the new generation, sort of the internet bank, is not subject to the same constraints as your Wells Fargo, which used to be constrained to the state, let alone the country. I mean, the US banking system is fractured in bizarre ways at state boundaries. And then, so what you've got is this new generation of services, like PayPal is probably a good example of a traditional business that they're building basically an internationally centered bank. But with Netflix, if you happen to be on vacation in Europe, and this is, I guess, probably a fairly European crowd, and you happen to be in the UK or soon somewhere in the Nordics, you just fire up your iPhone and start watching Netflix. We may not have the same content you had here, but the service is still there, and there is maybe different things to watch with different subtitles.
It's the same account.
It's the same login. We should, if all bugs and whatever not being there, it should recognize your cookie. You should not even have to log in. You're a member. The cookie should be valid. Your iPhone should just say, I'm sorry, that movie's not available, but here's some stuff that is. Right?
I can tell you that I tried that a year ago last summer. I've been in Germany every 2 years, my family. So I couldn't do it. I had a VPN. I had to buy $15.
Well, Germany, sure. We don't have service in Germany.
But it turns out you do. Yeah. But you don't know.
Oh, with a VPN, we have no idea where you're.
Exactly.
It's an IP address that appears to be in America. Fine.
You know it. $15.
There are ways that we can kind of figure that out.
I mean, the natural boundary here is linguistic. You want the German movies, you want the French movies, you want the English movies, and your boundary is the language you speak. Well, they have subtitles for you. Whereas we have this geographical thing that's the historic version that involves them shipping reels of film around, that means that they're released in different territories at different times, and then you have a rights department that probably spends their time down there.
You buy the rights, you go to LA and you give them a certain amount of money for the rights, and they slice those rights as finely as they can. You can buy the rights to do a particular brand of phone, to stream movies, but not on any other kind of phone. All right, so they will slice and dice, so you don't pay very much because it's a very narrow right. So somebody else can buy the right to the next phone on the line, right? Or you can buy the rights to all mobile phones, or you can buy the standard definition rights to a PC, or you can buy additionally the high definition rights to a PC. All these things are separate. What's happened over time is Netflix is buying a larger and larger proportion of those rights in terms of device spread, but then the other way it slices geography, and we're currently buying more and more of the geographies. And our end game in a few years is that we're everywhere in the world and we buy the global rights to everything. And the shortcut is we're now making our own content where we have the rights because we've got our content.
Yes,
we can show it everywhere, and if we want to, we can sell it to somewhere. Let's say we don't have service in Germany at some point, we could sell it to German TV because we own the rights and we're selling it. It's the opposite direction of that.
Right.
But that's the game we're playing. I wanted to come back to something earlier, though, which was, you were talking about Salesforce and the sales reps and how they come in, which is that you've effectively got a viral application, because sales reps, in particular, move between companies relatively frequently.
Yes.
And you want them to be really productive on day one, because they might only stick around for that sales year, right? And they are coin-operated machines, and I've worked in sales, and I know them well. And they are very good at extracting money from customers. That's what they're for. And you want them to be productive. And if they know how to use Salesforce, now you can just hire them. Do you know Salesforce? If you don't know how to operate Salesforce, how can you learn quickly? You've got an extra question. So it becomes harder to hire people that don't know the tools of the trade. So this has now become a different kind of standard, which is the employees know how to use it. It's like hiring a Java programmer. And, well, it's a C++ guy, we might be able to teach in Java, we're not sure, right? But it's a sales rep that knows how to use Salesforce, using it for a couple of years. It becomes the standard is now in the expertise of the end users. And this is also what happened with SAP. I remember 10, 15 years ago when SAP became the big thing, was everyone had bespoke internal financials and sales and distribution, and okay, we have standard modules for this now, and they're customized, but you still have a lot of standardization, and you've learned how to use SAP, you can learn how to use it in another company. So there's another level of standardization there in whether you can find a workforce easily that can use it. So it's beyond the company, it's into the...
So it's a uniformity in the vocabulary and in the design vocabulary and the
process as well.
Well, we're
the process.
We're a very developer organized. I mean, Netflix, from top to bottom, is basically all developers. There's a few other people around that buy movies and stuff, but it's you know, we have people in LA whose job is to just buy movies, and they're the non-technical bit of Netflix. But think of Netflix as sort of 1,000 developers, and really no operations people. We're run by a developer. You know, the CEO is really a developer. Okay? So we don't really have the IT ops guys telling us they can't do things because our CEO tells them to go away. And we don't have a CIO position. We have a VP of employee productivity, who is the nearest thing, who runs corporate IT. And he was hired on that was what it said on the job spec when he was hired. And he runs he's a brilliant guy. He just got our Wi-Fi to run 150 megabits in the buildings. He's posting speed tests to Twitter. It's like, look, I got it to 100 megabits, and I got, you know, that's his idea of employee productivity. So we're having fun with that. But what he's doing is he's taking all of our internal corporate IT that's lurking in the data center, and we're shipping it out to SaaS vendors. So we're using Workday for all our HR stuff. We're using OneLogin as a SaaS front end that gives us a login portal. So you only have to log in once, and it's all SAML with you into security. We're using, on the operations side, we use PagerDuty, which is a calling tree that calls people and duty rotas and things, on-call rotas. Box.net and Evernote. We have corporate logins on all of these things that's set up. You know, he has an iPhone 5 on day one. That's our, you know,
that's productivity.
That's what we have, and he's going, yeah, okay. I just got a loan. I'm about to go to Europe, and they gave me a phone with iOS 6 on it. Yeah. So we have iPhones internally, but I expected there would be a bit of qualification testing before they put iOS 6 on all our iPhones, and then I got a loaner with iOS 6 on it. So it's like, yeah, we can do all that. You can have all these corporate rules that prevent you doing stuff, or you can just do it, and it's much more a matter of attitude than anything else.
But I think the iPhone and the iPad are another brilliant example of standard or new standards or evolving standards. Right? If you think
something
about
that drives the standard.
Right. If you think about it, that before that we all worked on the assumption that the standard for operating the screen is you have to have some buttons and you can click on it, and off you go, and your software screen works, right? Now with the iPhone and the iPad, and doing this, if you think about the new generations of buyers, users, whatever coming in.
We have 3-year-olds that are upset that the TV set doesn't work when you swipe it.
My 3-year-old.
Yeah, my kid did that with TV.
Isn't it?
I like that.
My 3-year-old asked me if my laptop was broken. Exactly. He couldn't watch a cartoon by doing this. So, it's like, okay, this doesn't work, this is broken.
Yeah.
So,
that is an epidemic of that.
And if you think about that, where that came from, and I think that's where the whole question of vendors driving standards, I think, is I think that needs to be flipped on the head.
Is there a standard for touch? Is there actually a standard for...
Exactly. Somebody came out with this disruptive idea, and it's gaining momentum.
But this is part of what was, this in the enterprise, you've seen this. The assumption was, I'm using a Windows PC running IE6 with ActiveX controls, and that is the environment we're developing into, and we're kind of stuck with it because we built stuff this way. And suddenly, everyone's bringing in their phones and their iPads and going, I want to use this system, and IT's like, well, we can't. Oh, no, we can't run IE6 on that. Oh, we have to make an HTML5 interface for you. We have to come up with some other way of doing this. And that's been, watching that happen over the last 2 or 3 years has been fascinating, because it meant that we actually got to break that logjam of, no, you shall do it this way, and you're stuck with it, to the point where Microsoft is now saying, HTML5 is the future, we're throwing away Windows, we've got Windows 8 and these HTML5 apps, where Adobe is saying, yeah, Flash, forget that, all our tools know HTML5.
You can tell it's HTML5 if it doesn't run on IE.
Oh, yeah, it depends which
I've done a little bit. I think so.
But this are like
maybe they fixed IE.
But the They don't care. They don't want to have to care, right? And this is the nice thing, I think, your point, like, you know, why the iPhone was so gigantic, amongst other things, was they didn't have to care. They didn't have to know about anything other than they couldn't get Flash.
But they would say, why isn't it working on this? You know, it stopped being your machine is wrong to your system is wrong. And didn't you guys port WebKit to PS3 so you could use the same stuff?
The Wii and the PS3 interface are actually, the app you download is actually a WebKit, a custom buildable WebKit browser that knows how to play movies, and our user interface is downloaded into it. It's all HTML5. It doesn't look remotely like that. It looks like a native interface.
Right.
But that's how it's actually built.
And wouldn't you also say that because of the speed with which these things can be done, it used to be you would have imposed standards, whether it was the IT organization imposing them, an industry imposing them. In many cases, when it comes to the technical standards, the speed with which standards were defined and the speed with which things were developed used to be roughly the same. Everybody complained that standards took twice as long to develop as technology. Now, we're dealing with the speed with which new things come about, the speed with which you guys at Netflix literally turn over all of your code and the way it operates is, you know, astonishing.
But that's what we've optimized for. So we took the cloud infrastructure, and if you look at companies getting into cloud, it's either driven by operations or development or business. If it's business, it's SaaS. If it's the developers, you're optimizing for agility and speed of development. That's what we do. So everything is subservient to speed of development. We spend most of our revenue on movies. The amount we actually spend on infrastructure is a relatively small percentage. So it's not a make or break on the business. And we're also growing rapidly, so we have very unpredictable capacity requirements. So that's the classic case where a public cloud infrastructure is just the right strategy for you. If you're churning out widgets and you know exactly how many you're going to be making for the next year, you can optimize that infrastructure, and it's all about getting cost out of those widgets. And that's generally an operations-driven culture, and you're very predictable. And running on cloud doesn't make a great deal of sense there. You can you can take all of that extra cost out yourself because it's predictable.
So let me turn the question back to you first, and then I'll go around. If you stood back and said, there are aspects of what I do that depend on agreements between me and my vendors. There are aspects of what I do that, if I didn't want to use the term standard, I would just use a shared agreement. What are those shared agreements without which you wouldn't be able to deliver Netflix?
I think we could probably figure out how to do it just about anything.
I would agree with that. I'm like,
there's an area. Actually, I've got one specific area which is probably worth pointing out, which is that we currently deliver video to PCs and Macs using Silverlight. And the reason for that goes back to wanting to use the Play-Ready DRM, which has a very flexible architecture, which we actually fitted the way we wanted to operate. And so we have that. And then I was actually presenting internally to some guys at the Mozilla Foundation, and one of the guys said, I want this running on Linux. And because Silverlight doesn't run on Linux. And they said, when are you going to do that? And they said, well, when are you going to get the HTML5 protected video tag running in Firefox? And he said, okay, fair enough. That's a fair call. Right. So if they got that running, we wouldn't actually need Silverlight, but we need a DRM hook directly into the browser, and we're waiting for the HTML5 standard to settle on that, and as soon as one browser implements that, we'll go for it, and then the other browsers will just get slipstreamed in. But we're waiting for the first usable implementation of the protected video tag. And that's a standard that has relying on somebody else, and it's blocking us from making a technology transition, because Silverlight is in end of life, but it still works, but it's annoying to have to download a plugin in order to play movies.
Would you say then that, and just a second, would you say then that the way in which standards are defined or agreed upon has really changed to the point where what you're looking for is the first one that actually does something that works, that's exposed in a way that can be cloned, used by others, so forth. It is the speed with which all of this is happening and the way in which all of the companies sitting up here compose applications and compose systems that really has changed the nature of it and therefore changed our reliance on what a standard really needs to be in order to benefit us.
To some extent, think of Netflix as one of the killer apps that drives adoption, right?
So that's what I was trying to say. You're a de facto standard because if I launch a mobile device without Netflix, I look stupid.
If you notice that the iPad was launched with Netflix on day one, that was a incredibly quick, top secret internal development, which was quite bizarre because we couldn't advertise for iOS developers. We had to figure it out internally because we couldn't admit we even had seen any of these things or anything before the launch. So that was that kind of thing. So we were there on day one. We helped the iPad become successful, and we've helped the Apple TV become successful. But so we drive the platform, and then we get sort of feedback through that.
I'm going to ask, actually, Barbara and Greg, in the broadest sense, an agreement, a uniform set of expectations between you and your customers or between you and your vendors. Is there something that, if I call that a standard, this uniform agreement, without which you just really could not operate, could not do business?
I think it's probably similar to what you said, which is that we can deliver packaged software to a customer that operates based on a standard understanding of what a sales process, HR process, talent, acquisition process, performance management process, should look like, right? Because we've looked at enough of them across industries to kind of know what it's like. Of course, we can completely flip it around and do a custom development for somebody, and it's just a different model, right? It's a different price tag, it has different contracts attached to it, all that kind of thing. It's possible, but again, it's about, I think what's so unique at the moment is just that the speed at which things are happening between the technology and combine that with a fundamental shift on who's deciding and buying. And I think that's what's making this standards discussion somewhat challenging sort of in the middle, because it's sort of a bit of a hangover from a very different world where decisions were made much more slowly by a much more predefined and predictable group of people.
Yeah, I think this is a great point, and you made the point earlier, the customer with buying power, for whom you're building, has changed, their requirements changed, and the ability of an SAP or a Salesforce to deliver and to meld, modify their offer to fit the customer, the speed with which that happens today is light speed compared to what it was just a few years ago.
Adrian said, which is, the new standard comes, from the side all of a sudden because somebody makes something that the customer wanted work with a new piece of technology, and then the others, don't really have much of a choice but to kind of, follow suit if they like it or not, because that's where the customer pull is happening.
Now I want to hear from the guy that lives in the city.
Yeah, so I mean, look, we're same thing, right? So we'll do all sorts of unnatural acts of IT. We just need the money, right? It's okay, right? So the big idea thing, there's also the same between things that are incrementally better and things that are gigantically better make a big difference, right? So that'll have a big impact, and people will actually all gravitate to that pretty quickly if it's really the right answer. To me, the iPad as a tablet delivery, it's it was a no-brainer. You look at it, you're like, that's what we're talking about, right? So everybody, in spite of everything else, everybody would gravitate toward that. To your point, there's a lot of speed of change, although I would say to a certain extent that's a speed of expectation of change by the customer base that they aren't necessarily willing or able to follow. They're looking for us to help them. We may or may not be able to help them on their budget and their thing. But a little bit back to one of your point, and I'll just throw it out real quickly. If you look at app development today that's happening, there's a space of app development's happening very quickly. It's in the cloud, it's on handheld devices, you know, it's great, right? It's fast moving, it's ubiquitous, you can get stuff out there very quickly. That's a very different space than, you know, our older world of packaged software and so forth. And so from the service provider view, we're in a way sort of stuck with a lot of legacy application that has no idea that there's a cloud world happening, right? So we spend enormous amounts of energy trying to put a bubble around applications and tell them it's all the same, it's all okay, right? Nothing's changed, right? Even though we're whisking them around and doing vMotion and moving all their data, they have no idea that's going on. The app has no idea.
Your old MAC address and IP.
Yeah, exactly. Hard-coded IP address. It's crazy, right? So sort of like, you know, back to the standards thing, what's markedly missing, and maybe at the end of the day it doesn't matter. So maybe at the end of the day, so I sit on my Mac and now I'm going to start buying stuff through the App Store. So, you know, maybe it all goes away at the end of the day. But packaged applications in general have no awareness around cloud. They don't live in our cloud. So in my world of delivering all the infrastructure and the application management and the automated provisioning and automated operations and integrated, you know, CMDBs and just like all that it takes to deliver that application, those apps just are completely unaware that that's going on, and now they're becoming a bit of a dinosaur because we're having to deal with them in such a crazy way. But I think SAP, you're in the middle of that transition, right? So you're trying to get stuff SAP more out online. You have both, right? And you can see that pressure that you kind of want to get out. I'm talking with Microsoft at a meeting, and they're going, Azure has changed us as a company, right? They're saying, all of our people thought Azure was just like some sort of crazy, you know, thing, and they live in like these multi-year package application delivery cycles. But the Azure guys now, you know, you can just see all this gravity going. They're saying, like, you know what, doing updates every quarter is cool, right? And it's meaning that they don't have these long packaged software development cycles. They can actually be doing that sort of on a constant, ongoing basis. So that's having an effect on them. So I think that legacy package application that, you know, we used to put diskettes in, you know, that sort of thing, is going to go away, I hope, and I think this more rapid, lighter weight, you know.
We do about 10 updates a day.
Yeah, exactly, right? Because you want to do that, but it's hard to do that in a big, you know, Office 2007. Right?
And this is
one. We have a big thing.
Here's the advantage of the Salesforce. You know, behind the, you know, that nice hard candy shell on the outside, it can be a roiling and changing.
It's a horror.
I mean, but you don't have to see it.
So the difference between the two is someone else calling your code and relying on the API and staying the same. With Netflix, you have a known set of those, and you've abstracted a piece of it, so you can deploy the HTML piece randomly to the different sites, and it will be reasonably sure to work the same across them. Because you don't have an external API where people putting something else on that.
Well, we do, and that is more stable, but the implementation behind it is changing very rapidly.
Because
the system behind the public API is being rewritten continuously.
But just you talking about the velocity with which things change and the speed of development. The speed with which HANA came to be and the approach that SAP has been taking with the rollout of HANA is very unlike it has gone on traditionally within SAP. And I think SAP is recognizing the benefit of taking that approach.
I think there's a lot of things going on, especially in the last 2 years, that you would describe as unlike the old SAP.
Exactly.
Be it the way we develop applications, the speed at which we develop them, and quite honestly, the kinds of applications that we deliver. You know, to your earlier point, we have both, right? We have the traditional on-premise applications, and you know, make no mistake, they run a very big portion of a lot of companies. But on the other side, you know, customers want to add on, you know, the mobile applications, making sure, you know, when you're a sales rep and you're out in the field, you get the stuff mobile. Everybody's going mobile. So, but you know, there's a very different approach to mobile applications. You can't just replicate, you know, an application that was written for a big screen like that and try to make it really small to make it on a mobile, and nobody will able to read it. So
and the fact that it all has to come out and appear almost simultaneously on all of the platforms.
So you have to take a very different approach in terms of how you develop and think about mobile applications. That you know, HANA came from, you know, idea to market in about a year, which is, for what it is, really light speed, which is sort of true to the whole premise of it. But so, you know, we kind of operate now across the entire spectrum, and you know, that's an interesting challenge to be in the midst of.
So, as fun as it is for the group of us to talk to one another, it's now
Try
time.
to drinks up here, so.
Yeah, it's now time to open it up for questions and hopefully a few answers up here. So with that, I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking our panel, and thank you very much for your attention this evening.
And on behalf of Gaba, I would like to thank you, Rich, and I want to thank the panelists for this very lively, very informative discussion. So thank you very much, and hope to see you on one of our next panels. And before you all leave, I would like to make one announcement, which is Gaba has been around for, we are a non-profit, as you heard from Kellen earlier. We have been around for about 10 years. Next year, we are celebrating our 10th anniversary. And I would like to invite you to join us for our 10th anniversary Gaba Gala. It's going to be at the City Club in San Francisco. We will have good food, good people there, including yourself. And we will give out 2 Lifetime Achievement Awards. So if you want to sit next to Andy von Bechtolsheim, one of the co-founders of Sun Microsystems, buy a ticket. Make sure you sit right next to him. If you want to sit next to Professor Kasper, the 9th president of the Stanford University, buy a ticket, you get a table next to him. So please join us January 25th at the City Club in San Francisco. Thank you for coming out.